Good afternoon and welcome to the final final webinar in our series of autumn webinars. We are very grateful to have Meg Guerin-Calvert with us this afternoon. Meg is based in Washington, D.C. with Compass Lexicon Economists, and we've had the pleasure of working with Meg on a very long-ranging market inquiry into private healthcare in South Africa. So Meg, welcome and good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Great to be here.
Today, and fittingly for our last webinar, we are going to be discussing market inquiries. And if we turn to the first slide in our presentation, the issues we're going to cover in today's webinar are firstly an overview of the market inquiry process in South Africa, and we're going to focus a little bit about what can the Commission currently do in market inquiries in South Africa. Now, just to give some context, we've had under the previous legislation 2 informal market inquiries into banking and the grocery sector, and more recently, since the amendments to the Competition Act, we've had a number of formal inquiries, one into private healthcare, a very extensive one, which we'll talk about shortly, another fairly extensive one into groceries, and then a third one into LPG gas, which has been completed, but was a lot more concise and a lot quicker than the other 2, and 2 more recent inquiries into the transport sector and into data in the telecom sector. So there have been a broad range of inquiries to date, and we're going to discuss a little bit about the differences in approach in the various inquiries and what the potential outcomes are going to be. We're also going to talk about the powers of the Commission to conduct market inquiries and potential remedies in terms of the amendments to the Competition Act which have been proposed, which will fundamentally change the extent of the powers that the Commission has under market inquiries and the manner in which they go about them. We're then going to talk a little bit about the types of analyses that typically take place in market inquiries. What's the sort of economic analyses that typically take place? How does the Commission typically conduct these types of inquiries, and what are the potential outcomes? And then we're going to talk a little bit about the implications for business and the learnings and experience to be derived from the market inquiry process to date. If we turn to the next slide, we're also going to discuss what are the factors that affect the scope of issues, analyses, and outcomes. In other words, why is it that some inquiries tend to go on for a very long time and have very detailed economic analyses and other assessments, and other types of market inquiries tend to be much more abbreviated and don't seem to have the same level and extent of analyses? We're then going to discuss why do competition agencies and other regulators conduct market studies and market inquiries? What is the purpose behind this? Is it remedial to fundamentally change the nature in which business and companies behave in particular industries? Is it information gathering to enable agencies to have better insights into particular industries? Is it a function of the fact that particular industries are perceived as not functioning optimally or competitively? And these are all various factors which may trigger market inquiries. We're then going to look at what sectors are involved. Now, as I've mentioned, in South Africa, we've already had 2 inquiries into the grocery sector, 1 into banking, 1 into private healthcare, and currently into transport and the data in telecoms. But in Europe and the US, market inquiries have spanned multiple industries, and we're going to discuss that in a little bit more detail shortly. With the benefit of Meg's assistance today, we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about economic analytics and market studies. What are the typical types of analytics that one would expect, and how should one go about them? And how does one effectively determine what types of analytics are going to be most optimal in these types of inquiries? And then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about potential results and outcomes of these inquiries. if we turn to slide 3, I want to start by debating, what are the purposes of market inquiries and what are the types of outcomes that one should expect. And Meg, turning to you, obviously competition regulators and other regulatory authorities approach market inquiries sometimes differently depending on what the purpose of the inquiry is and what sort of outcome they're hoping to derive. And perhaps I could ask you to start off with just explaining in your experience, what are the typical types of purposes that you've encountered for market inquiries?
Great, Anthony. So basically, there have been any number of reports that have documented the range of inquiries that are there from those and also our own experience. Really, a key distinguishing feature of market studies, which have been used by a very large number of jurisdictions, by competition agencies, is really to look at issues and what might be competition concerns or market functioning concerns, more often than not in a specific sector, completely outside of the context of individual events or cases. So rather than looking at behaviors within a particular merger or an antitrust investigation, it's really to look at it more broadly in a sector and particularly to look at it market-wide. And as you have alluded to, it really is the case that, one market inquiry or market study, as they oftentimes are called, is maybe differentiated from a lot of others in terms of being very short, versus ones that really do have a very, very detailed formal process where the purpose of the market study or the market inquiry is to really understand the full scope of economic activity in a particular sector, whether it's healthcare or energy or banking or finance, and to be able to build and collect data in a way that it's not otherwise available in the marketplace. But I think the other important part is that not only is it useful for that broader focus, it's also important for looking at a broader perspective as to whether or not there might be regulatory or other types of artificial impediments to competition, including consumer behaviors and search costs, that may keep the market from functioning as well as it might, and yet may not necessarily rise to the level of an antitrust issue. To answer your other question, there are a whole range of potential outcomes which depend on the very purpose of the market inquiry and also who's conducting it. I think the important things I would emphasize is that one critical feature of many market studies and inquiries that we see in the last 5 years is literally full finding, reporting, perspectives, knowledge, without necessarily a recommendation for a direct intervention or an action. Sometimes there may well be recommendations by the competition agency running the inquiry, but really recommendations for perhaps legislative changes or for policy reform, or it could be, depending on the authority, change in enforcement action. And I think if we can go to the next slide, let me just kind of very briefly give you an oversight. In the last couple of years, there have been some major workshops and reports. There was a comprehensive survey done in 2015 of almost 60 jurisdictions, and it showed that there was this multiple purpose for the market studies, including competition, looking at it for enforcement, thinking about advocacy and changes, as I mentioned, knowledge base, but also looking at assessment. Most are really using market studies to assess the state of competition and how the market is functioning. That can be because there is pre-existing indicators that perhaps the market is not functioning competitively as well as it might. And so the inquiry is to look at and examine whether or not that initial information is borne out, or there might be other explanations, or some of it could also be market failure concerns about whether or not consumers have access to sufficient information. That's another, important focus that is a marketplace consumer protection concern, but may not be a pure competition concern. Another key area is really, and if we look at the history of the various market studies that are out there, particularly if it's a whole new sector or one that is heavily regulated and undergoing significant change in who the entities are, the nature of the relationships, and where there may also be ongoing public policy or regulatory changes, those are key circumstances in which we see market studies being used around the globe. And then lastly, as I mentioned, this developing critical knowledge about an industry or a market where data is typically not available is the last purpose of market inquiries.
Meg, I want to pick up on two issues that you raised on the last two slides. I mean, the one question that one often gets from clients is, how do competition agencies and regulators pick particular sectors or industries as the subject of, market inquiries? How is it that they select particular industries at given points in time, which is always, a fairly interesting question. For example, in South Africa, we're in the process of the second inquiry into the grocery sector not long after the first inquiry ended. So, the question is often posed, well, why the grocery sector again, for example? And sectors like private healthcare have been the subject of inquiries, extensive inquiries in the UK, now in South Africa, and in other jurisdictions like the US. So it's an interesting question about why regulators choose particular sectors. And do you think that perhaps there's perhaps a bit of an ideological element involved here? I know, I appreciate that's a bit of a loaded question, but do regulators choose sectors because they're perceived as potentially sensitive sectors, and that's why they spend particular time and focus on those types of sectors? Or do you think that there are other factors underpinning the choice of particular industries or sectors?
I think there's a number of factors. One is one key factor that clearly has been the case is where it is that you have a significant amount of transactional or enforcement activity, and where there's, let's just call it, a lot of repeat business before the agencies, and also a potential concern that there may be significant issues with regard to pricing, performance, and or relationships. That's one aspect that has triggered some of the market inquiries. But I think, one of the reasons, for example, why sectors such as private healthcare across, using, for example, even in the United States, why there's been extensive inquiry going all the way back to 2004 is both because of that repeat business, but also an understanding that it's an industry that's not just a single sector. So healthcare is an example, and private healthcare, it's not just the hospital sector, it's also the physician or the consultant sector, it's pharmaceuticals, it's medical schemes or health plans and insurers, it's outpatient facilities. So you have multiple levels, multiple players, and also a lot of it is information and data that is not necessarily readily available to the government or to the competition agency and its sectors that are high profile, to go to your point on potential ideological or policy concerns. It's very, very high profile, and there are concerns raised by many as to whether or not this is sectors that can rely on competition. So sometimes that, for example, in the U.S., whether or not one could rely on competition to discipline private health care was a key focus of some of the inquiries. So that's one aspect. On things like grocery and energy, the issues sometimes are with regard to, again, different levels of distribution, different interests and concerns, and a variety of, I would say, more business practices that are under investigation or inquiry as to whether or not they are in some way inhibiting competition. So that's another reason for that choice. Lastly, some are also looking at issues where there may be concerns as to whether consumers are getting the kinds of information and data that they need. So on a broader concern, so not just competition, I think, Anthony, that goes to things like personal banking services and other kinds of services where the concern is really not so much about market power or exercise of it, but the ability of the marketplace to have consumers get access to the kind of information that they need to make good decisions.
And Meg, can I pick up on another issue that you raised when you were talking about the range and scope of businesses which are often implicated in these types of inquiries? And I think you alluded to the example of private healthcare, where it involves physicians and medical schemes and hospitals and a whole range of industries which fall under the banner of private healthcare. And I guess one of the questions that often comes up is, to what extent can agencies and regulators genuinely assess and extract sufficient detail if they're covering such broad territory in often limited periods of time? Can one legitimately expect a regulator or a competition agency to really be able to get to the nitty-gritty, if you'll forgive the expression, of such a broad range of businesses and sectors within an industry? And isn't that one of the reasons why, to be blunt, agencies and regulators don't always get it right in these types of inquiries, because they, in a very concentrated period of time, are trying to get a handle on such a broad and diverse range of business interests within a sector? And isn't that often quite a difficult thing to do in a limited period of time?
I think while it certainly is difficult, and time is a really important dimension in it all, I think what I have seen occur is an effort being made, particularly where the inquiry is in a very broad sector with multiple dimensions and levels, is an effort at the very start of the inquiry to have as clear as possible of a statement of issues as to what exactly is going to be within the scope of the inquiry itself, so as potentially to take off the table, and this is what I've seen done, for example, in part in the UK and also in part in the US, the FTC and the DOJ, for example, when they looked at healthcare, did it in stages, but certainly to identify the key issues. But I think, to go to your point, it is vital to get the stakeholder engagement and to have the opportunity for those who are involved at the various levels of the industry to be able to provide, whether it's on a compulsory basis or a voluntary basis, to be able to provide their views and perspectives on the nature of competition. Particularly, it requires really trying to get in and understand how the market works. So not only looking at structure, conditions, performance, but looking across the sector, trying to be forward-looking, be more taking into account dynamic factors, not just static, so looking at entry. And then, I think a difficult issue is really trying to look at, what are the barriers or the impediments? Are they ones that can be overcome? And how is it that competition can work? But I think also providing an opportunity for clear hypotheses to be set out, for reports, analytics, data analyses, and information to be presented so that there's a variety of perspectives, but also just very, very solid, you're hearing the economists speak here, very solid empirical basis on which to evaluate. I think that, is a set of ways to try to certainly build the knowledge base on the industry, and then also to decide whether or not, it's important for any intervention to occur, or instead to use the market inquiry to inform and establish a baseline understanding.
And I think just to, dive into some of the detail on slide 5, I think what you're saying, which I agree with unequivocally, is that it's very, very important in these types of inquiries to have a very clear statement of issues at the outset and to clearly demarcate the particular areas and issues that the market inquiry intends to cover, because then at least that informs everyone who's getting involved in the process a clear sense of what the topics are, what the issues are, and what sort of studies and analyses need to be done in relation to those particular topics. And it's important not to sort of deviate from that, because then at least everyone has a clear understanding from the outset about what the issues are and what type of analyses are going to be covered. And it's also, I think, interesting that certainly from a South African point of view, and I'll ask you to comment shortly on your experience in the US and Europe, but market inquiries here have certainly taken different forms. So, for example, in the inquiry into private healthcare, it started off with fairly extensive public hearings, which were open to the public and obviously to various stakeholders to present on various topics and issues, and then involved a series of fairly detailed interactions in relation to various papers that were published, as well as a data room being established with various confidential data which could be accessed and reports published. Other inquiries in South Africa have been far less formal. There have been no public hearings, no data rooms, a short statement of issues and some, papers being exchanged on particular topics. But the nature of the inquiry has been far less formal, far less rigorous, and obviously far more condensed time periods. And I just wanted to get your view about whether you've also observed a similar type of practice in other jurisdictions where the range and extent of issues has sometimes been more limited and the formalities have sometimes differed from inquiry to inquiry.
Yes, I would say using healthcare as an example, there's been a wide range of approaches, and I'd say one of the key distinguishing features as to whether or not it's a less formal, more high level, done, let's say, almost all on the papers and on reports, is where the sets of issues is much more limited. where it's an individual inquiry into a specific set of business practices, where it's a more or less an information gathering exercise. This has been done on pharmaceuticals, to some extent much shorter in terms of looking at vaccines, and others where the overall structure has not been as formal or as lengthy. But even using healthcare as an example, there can be a less formal process where one is not looking at data rooms and collections of using compulsory process to get data and information from participants, but nonetheless you still have a very robust set of hearings and reports and other materials that then may be assessed by an agency staff to present a final report. So I would say that one of the common features I've seen, even between a little bit less formal and more formal, that really advances when one is looking at an entire industry and its overall behavior and performance and trying to understand it, as opposed to looking at a business practice or certain kinds of conduct. I'd say a key feature there is lots of reports and analysis on market structure, conditions, pricing analyses, other kinds of analyses, and usually an exchange at least of views, if not of reports, on the need for and or the benefits of various forms of interventions. So that's a common feature, even if there isn't the kind of data room type aspect. And what you can see on the slide here, this just gives you an idea of the incredible range of sectors on which there have been one or more market studies in more than 60 jurisdictions. There are several, such as insurance, e-commerce, groceries, as you mentioned, health, and even transport, where there have been multiple inquiries across various jurisdictions. And I think because these particularly are industries that are going through a significant amount of change, and yet even those have been sometimes more limited and then others much broader.
And do you think that there's a bit of a common denominator in some of these sectors, that they are peculiarly consumer-facing, if I can call it that? In other words, they have a particular material and direct impact on consumers, and that appears to be a reason why some of them are selected. And I think, for example, of the groceries and health, the energy sector, etc., transport, etc., is they tend to be industries which have very direct impacts on consumers. And do you think that forms part of the reason why they are often chosen for these types of inquiries?
I think, even including other retail, it certainly is, just because it, encompasses such a significant portion of expenditure, is one aspect of it. I think the other related aspect, and it differs a little bit between, say, financial services and health and insurance, and to some extent retail, is the idea of, does the consumer have the ability in and of themselves, other than by choosing a different alternative, really have the tools and the ability to influence competition significantly, or is it all that much more important that there be competition and dynamics in the particular sector? But I think you're exactly right. These are ones that consumers day in and day out interface with and represent a significant amount of their expenditure. I think some of the ones like transport, e-commerce, and others are ones where transport is more in terms of is the market operating well? And so that may also because it's interfacing with the manufacturing and other sector. I think things like e-commerce are very much really trying to get a handle on where is change headed and what are the implications of it.
And I suppose another feature that some of these industries have in common is that some of them are also heavily regulated by other regulators and by other sector regulators. And I guess the question that's often arisen in some of these industries is, does the existing state of regulation in the sector, in a sense, perversely compromise or undermine competition or preclude competition from functioning effectively? And I don't know if you want to comment on that at all.
Well, I think if we go to the next slide, one of the issues that was looked at, particularly in the U.S. hearings, which were quite extensive by the FTC and DOJ starting in 2004, was exactly on that point, and it's evolved over time. There were a number of states that had certificate of need laws and regulations, which essentially included some requirements that hospitals and other providers had to fulfill in order to be able to provide services and or to set up new capacity or move into a marketplace. And there was a concern by the agencies and a lot of attention spent on whether or not that was in some way inhibiting competition or whether it was serving a beneficial function. So that was exactly to your point, a set of hearings and issues that not only looked at more traditional market definition, competitive effects, the nature of bargaining, but really looking at that. It's also an industry where for those most vulnerable and in poverty and those that are seniors, there's more regulated pricing. And so that was another dimension that was looked at in evaluating how that and the requirements on hospitals to have ERs open for all comers, how those implicated the financial and other aspects of healthcare. So those, I think, are important ones. And then finally, a lot of sectors such as nursing, even inputs such as contact lenses or physician services are regulated as to who can provide care, and that were the parts of entire market inquiries in the U.S. on those topics.
And it seems to me from what you're saying that, there are a couple of sort of, in a sense, key features of a lot of these inquiries. One is often around market definition, and that's important for determining who the competitive set are, who are the second is the bargaining dynamics in those particular sectors. How much bargaining power do consumers typically have relative to various companies and organizations within that sector, and linked to that are issues about concentration and the number and extent of competitors. And then often there will be a set of analyses around the extent to which regulation in the sector or the lack of regulation in the sector hampers competitive effects and the extent to which those sectors are truly competitive. In your experience, are those typically the types of issues that are often considered in these types of inquiries?
Yes, they are, and there's a whole array of looking at exactly those key kinds of what I would call as well more traditional analytics, which may be much more comprehensive in the context of a market inquiry, as well as looking at market imperfections or aspects, outside of the pure competition analysis that may affect how the market operates. And if you look at this slide here, this kind of gives you on the left-hand side what probably is the more traditional set of analytics looking at the supply side, so market structure, but again at every level of the industry. So if you're looking at energy, it might be at multiple levels of refining, production, distribution, retail. In healthcare, you're looking at any and all sets of providers, which oftentimes are employed by or operated by different entities. You're looking at a variety of different participants, and then looking at the overall sector characteristics, but then needing to apply market definition and then look at, some degree of integration. I think to go to your point, Anthony, in your question, a lot of the demand side analyses is not just looking at product market alternatives, what consumers are looking at, but in some of the industries that are the subject of the market inquiries, it really has been looking at and understanding, whether or not consumers have access to the kinds of information and data that would be helpful, but also it requires defining what that information is and whether it needs to be incredibly detailed or sufficient to be able to make good decisions. On the bottom left, I think this is what we see most frequently in market inquiries, even if we're not seeing a significant amount of detail in the upper two boxes, and that's looking at pricing trends, price concentration analyses to see if there is some relationship between some measures of structure and price, profitability analyses, and this is important to look at cause and effect and looking particularly at other drivers of economic profitability, a lot of looking at the theoretical and practical models of how price is determined and the nature of competition, and then this is the area in which we see a lot of the empirical and the econometric analyses. Lastly, to go to your point, I think the right-hand box is one that's increasingly important because many market inquiries are trying not just to do static analysis as to what does the marketplace look like now, but really trying to look at to see, are there dynamic factors that protect consumers and competition? It's the context in which proposed remedies are looked at. And I'd say on all of these, to go back to a question you asked earlier, one of the things that is somewhat advantageous is that many of the industries that are studied in a given jurisdiction, for example, South Africa, have been looked at in other sectors. And so one can look at and refer to and rely on, a broader set of information and data and comparative analysis. And then lastly, how much is done, when it is done, how it's engaged with from different participants really depends on the nature of the processes that the market inquiry has. In many cases, as you were referring to, it's a significant amount of data collection, data analysis, and then responsive reports and findings from many participants.
And Meg, just to pick up on that point, because I think that's a very important issue that you raise. And I want to ask both you and my colleague Avia Singwenya, who's also with us today and who's a fellow economist. I mean, in these inquiries, particularly where there's a lot of data that's being collected, and sometimes it's hugely extensive and from multiple parties, two issues appear to arise. I mean, the first is one's ability to properly collate and gather that data. And the second, and probably most important, is your ability to process that data using appropriate methodologies and appropriate analyses. And, to state the obvious, if the methodology or the way in which you are analyzing the data is not appropriate or incorrect, you stand to come to outcomes which may be, plainly misconceived in certain respects. And I want to ask both of you, and I'm going to ask IBS to comment to come to you, Meg, about the challenges in agencies, particularly where resources may be fairly limited, in really being able to get to grips with complex industries where there are lots of data and where this presents a significant challenge. IBS, your thoughts and comments on that?
Thanks, Anthony. I think as a starting point, it's important to know that employees or regulatory staff members aren't industry experts. And I think that's the first point. They're experts in what they do, which is competition analysis, but they wouldn't necessarily be experts within any given industry or sector. So it's on their own, it's often very difficult. And in many cases, what we find is when we engage with clients, there's often a steep learning curve, which we have to overcome in terms of understanding how that industry functions and operates. And you can think about the position of a regulator. I mean, they're obviously in a worse off position where they have to, from their perspective, often without cooperation, have to also overcome the same learning hurdles. And it becomes extremely difficult for them on their own to try and assess the impact or to try and assess whether or not there's a particular market failure. So I think a key point in this is the ability of the regulator not only to obtain the necessary information, but to rely on market participants to contribute to the process. So it's having an open process which is interactive with participants and stakeholders really is very important in allowing the regulator to let industry functions, number one. Number two, I think a very, very important factor is ensuring that they have the relevant expertise on hand to be able to apply the appropriate methodologies. And I think what we've learned from the approach in South Africa in healthcare, and you can contrast it to the approach in the UK with the CMA, when they looked at the health market inquiry, is the manner in which you engage with stakeholders and industry experts prior to undertaking a particular analysis, and essentially discussing your methodology openly with stakeholders and saying, look, this is how we seek to analyze this market. This is how we seek to assess profitability or market definition, or this is how we seek to assess concentration levels within this market. Are we doing this thing in the right way? And if we're not, can we come up with a methodology beforehand, which is appropriate? And I think that's where you really need to have a regulator who's open to engagement, open to discussion, and open to different views. Because at the end of the day, if we all have the same aim, which is wanting to see markets operate more efficiently, then getting it done right the first time, I think, is the most appropriate thing. And the worst thing you could do is to a 30-page information request, only to find out 2 years later that the methodology which was applied was completely flawed and without basis. Then you've wasted 2 years of a lot of work. I mean, Meg, I don't know what you think on that.
Well, I think in terms of the issues that you set out, to me, one of the things that I do think what I have seen facilitate the collection, but particularly the analytics, is to really recognize, and for the competition agency running the market inquiry to really recognize that there are some first principles and some methodologies and some best practices that are there for the kinds of issues and analyses. So, for example, there are some, standard and well-developed approaches that go to doing profitability analyses and pricing analyses in a economically sound way. Similarly, price concentration and other kinds of analyses. Now, there can be differences in the data sets that people have access to. There can be some differences in methodologies. So I do think that it is really important for the agency, if they, particularly where they may not have any and all of the resources themselves to do that analysis, is to really try to establish a structure that invites and engages market participants and their experts to make use of and have access to the data and information as early as possible, and for the various analytics to get tested and evaluated. So that kind of goes back to the key issues as to the nature of the process, the nature of the availability of data, and also to the methodology. So I think that's very important. I think the other part is the kind of thinking about your point, Avias, where agencies may have limited resources, even in the context of litigation and mergers. It is still feasible for them to, I think, really develop the right, I would call, evidentiary record. And I think that gets back to the key point, is that looking at, the sets of analyses that are being done is making sure that, if we could go back to the prior slide for a moment, is to make sure that you really have done each and every one of these components, and that you have not just, left yourself in the static analysis on the top left-hand quadrant, but that you've really looked at all the other quadrants as well, is, I think, the important part. So it's to solicit and provide the data. And then I think what we've all learned is the importance of really being able for market participants to be able, to the extent possible, to vet each other's analytics and to vet the agency's analytics. That's been critical in a couple of these market inquiries.
Meg, can we then turn to the types of outcomes, findings, and conclusions that can emanate from these types of inquiries? Some of them we know are, confined to things tree reform, where they say, well, the existing regulation in the sector is stifling competition, or if you amended legislation in a particular way, you could encourage more competition. Some of them are confined to that. Others focus on market structure and concentration and suggest that the market is structured or the levels of concentration are not conducive to competition, and may sometimes suggest remedies in order to cater for that. Then you get some where, and these are, I think, somewhat unusual, but you do get them sometimes, where they say, in the course of the inquiry, we've come across conduct considered to be prohibitive, that this type of conduct should be prosecuted by the various agencies concerned, because it looks like there's anti-competitive behavior in the sector. And then finally, there's what I call the rather drastic remedial type of action, where certain regulators will come to the view that absent divestments, sale of assets, or breakup of particular industries or sectors, that competition otherwise is not going to effectively exist in the type of form that the agency would like. And we know, for example, in some of the inquiries that have been held in Europe recently, and I'm thinking in the UK, there's been some suggestions of divestitures, although those recommendations were ultimately reversed once it became clear in that particular case that the agency concerned hadn't processed the data appropriately. Do you want to talk a little bit about your experience with market outcomes and the sort of range of outcomes and conclusions that can emanate from these types of inquiries?
Yes, thanks, Anthony. So I think as you look at this chart that's here, at the upper part, a lot of times, as I mentioned at the beginning, the market inquiry has developed because of the fact that there was an awareness that the marketplace was not perhaps operating as well as it could, and yet the concern or the nature of the competitive marketplace problem that was detected was not something that was evidence of market power or coordination or anti-competitive behavior, but really something with regard to more consumer protection. So in many of those cases, and this is, I think, particularly true in some of the financial services inquiries, it's really been ones that have suggested that there be changes in banking or consumer protection regulation to either improve access to data or information. And this indeed was part of, even in the competition context in the UK inquiry into private healthcare, some changes that were recommended there by the competition agency to others. I think the other part is where it may not be something that rises to the level of an enforcement action, but rather to have greater knowledge and information about particular types of conduct, either by individual firms or more broadly. I think to go to your question on divestiture or structural remedies, those have been relatively infrequent, not to say not there at all. And I think that some of that really is, some of it goes, and this is the economist speaking, to the authority that the agency may have or not have. But I think as in the UK, there was a long statement that came out from the CMA saying that they had detected and evaluated certain concerns that raised some concerns about competition, but were concerned that alternatives such as either a divestiture or price regulation may have significant unintended consequences, may be very costly, and that they thought that the marketplace on balance would potentially be worse off rather than better off, and that they did not recommend that and rejected it as an alternative. And so I think that again gets to that the competition authority is looking at, trying to have the market work as best as possible, look at efficiency, and look at dynamics, and the fact that various kinds of remedies, whether it's divestiture or other forms of significant regulation, may actually move the market in unintended ways and may also not be proportional to the issues that are there. I think the other thing that's important on this last one is that while it is listed here as a potential remedy, it's listed as a key outcome, and I would emphasize this, is I think from virtually all of the market inquiries that have been significant, the published record and the information as to where it is there may be competition issues and significant advancement in understanding of an industry have both informed policymakers as to the importance of thinking about competition in their actions, and also has given some insights that help for future mergers and so on, but just move things well far forward from where they were before the data and the information were collected.
I can move on to the slide which deals with the changes to the South African Competition Act in particular, because this is potentially going to usher very, very far-reaching changes to the current regime dealing with market inquiries. Because as things currently stand, once the Commission has completed a market inquiry, its powers are reasonably limited in the sense that it can make recommendations to various ministers about potential changes that it believes should in a particular industry or sector to obviously foster competition or in the public interest. or it can initiate direct remedial action in the competition tribunal to prosecute particular conduct which it has identified in the course of its market investigation. But it doesn't have the ability beyond that to impose any particular remedial measures that it itself believes need to be introduced in a particular industry or sector as a consequence of any findings that it has made. Now, all of that could change very significantly if the proposed amendments to the Competition Act come into force, because there are two features of the amendments which are particularly important. The one is that the test that the Commission will apply in conducting market inquiries is, in a sense, a relatively low threshold to some extent, because, as you will see from the slide, all that the Commission is required to establish is some form of adverse effects on competition, whether as a consequence of any feature or combination of features on a market. And the types of features that the Commission can have regard to include the levels of concentration and ownership in the market, barriers to entry, conduct whether inside or outside the market, and this rather controversial term of conscious parallelism or coordinated behavior. And I think we had a question from one of the listeners during the webinar about the extent to which the ability of SMMEs to compete against larger, more established organizations in a market may be an issue in market inquiries. And certainly, I mean, it seems to me that that may well be an issue which will come into the reckoning in market inquiries of this kind going forward, and will be the type of issue that competition authorities will look at, which is really the extent to which smaller players are able to compete effectively and efficiently in particular markets, particularly relative to larger, well-resourced competitors. So, I would think in a South African context, that is particularly an issue which is going to come into focus and which we will see, play out in a lot more of these inquiries. And then the second feature, which is taken up on slide 11 of the presentation, is the types of remedial powers that the Commission will enjoy if these amendments go through. And in particular, the Commission is required. It doesn't even have a discretion, but it is required in terms of these amendments to take whatever remedial action it believes is reasonable and practical to remedy adverse effects on competition once it has concluded an inquiry. And this can go so far as including divestiture orders, in other words, requiring companies to sell off businesses or assets to remedy any perceived adverse effect on competition. So these are very far-reaching and wide-ranging powers that the Commission will enjoy if these amendments come into force, and are particularly in contrast to their existing powers, which are really confined to making recommendations and referring cases to the Competition Tribunal for adjudication. So it appears to us, Meg, that really if these amendments come into force, that it may have far-reaching implications for market inquiries going forward, because the Commission will have very considerable remedial powers at its disposal. And apart from divestiture orders, which will need to be confirmed by the Competition Tribunal before they can come into force, the Commission will have the ability at the conclusion of a market inquiry to really make some very potentially far-ranging orders, which could include things like price regulation and so forth. And I don't know if you've got any particular views on that.
Well, in terms of the legal views, no. I do know that in a number of areas that have looked at and considered these market power these market studies and these kinds of powers, there have been comments submitted, for example, by the section of antitrust law and the section of international law that go to, I know, for example, this has been done in New Zealand, that goes toward looking at, what the standards are that are in place to, connect the linkage and to more or less kind of look at and set out, whether or not the competition agency has to kind of follow the same processes it does for other types of activities. But I know, for example, I could refer the audience to the comments that were filed with regard to the New Zealand market studies that address some of the issues that you talked about that indicated, the importance of being cautious as to the scope of powers. But on the specifics, I would defer to others, but I do know that that's an area that has been addressed in other jurisdictions.
And I think one final observation from my side on this particular issue is that obviously in a market inquiry, it's not like an investigation into a prohibited practice where evidence gets led by witnesses and you can test the veracity and quality of the evidence through cross-examination of both factual and expert witnesses. In market inquiries, you don't often have that same level of rigor in relation to testing the evidence that is derived. And obviously, it's therefore of critical importance in those types of inquiries that if you're going to have the power to make far-reaching decisions, which have significant implications for business and industry, that the quality of the analysis and the quality of the evidence that you muster and the conclusions that you draw from that are that it's very, very important that those nexuses all follow from one another, because, obviously, if the type of evidence that you gather is deficient and the types of analyses that you employ are deficient, you may come to the wrong conclusions. And therefore that even, if your remedies are motivated by the best intentions, if the quality of the data and the evidence that you're using is poor, you may inevitably come to the wrong conclusions. And therefore it's incredibly important that you apply the same level of rigor to some extent as you would in an investigatory process, allowing for the fact that you may not have cross-examination, etc. And therefore it's even more important in a sense to ensure the integrity and quality of the data analysis that you perform. Meg, it's been wonderful having you this afternoon, and a great thank you from our side for your time today and for your insights on market inquiries. And thank you, and we wish you a good afternoon in Washington, and thank you for your time.
Thank you as well. I enjoyed it very much.
And thank you to our listeners. This is the last of our webinar series for this autumn, and thank you for participating and your time on the webinar today. That's us signing off in Johannesburg.